Welcome to Goldfish on Games, where today I will transport you to the steamy world of Locomotion, which was designed and developed by Chris Sawyer and published by Atari for Windows in 2004. This was, in the developer's own words, the spiritual successor to the very well regarded Transport Tycoon. Or as the box like to put it, from the developer of Roller Tycoon, and using that name is in many ways more important, as we'll see later on. With it being launched in the early 2000s, this only came in a DVD style case, with the game itself being on a single CD. But there was a 71 page manual, of which 60 pages was devoted to the English instructions, and it does go over the game in quite a lot of detail. And it will be quite useful for some of the more complicated parts of the game. But thankfully we won't need it for the very simple looking main menu, as it has none of those pesky options. It's just 6 simple buttons: New Game, Load Game, Tutorial, Scenario Editor, as well as being able to set up a multiplayer game, and obviously the Quit button. Where Transport Tycoon was more a sandbox first game, this is far more scenario focused, as we can see when we go to select a new game, as you have a number of difficulty settings, and in each of them you have various challenges for you to beat. There isn't any option here for a true sandbox, but you can work around that, but we'll swing back to that in a little bit, as I feel we should really dive into the gameplay first. So let's select a scenario and jump right in. Well, after you've entered the name of your company and then found the most fetching face you can possibly find for your CEO, glorious. For those that have gotten this far into this review and have no idea about the game, this is a transport sim, in which you have to move cargo from one place to another. Now that might be human, coal, rocks or mail, and you do this by building roads or rail tracks and then setting up routes for your vehicles to travel. And this really is the core part of the game. So let's look at it in more detail. And what's the best way of doing that? Well, building a road. And in this instance, I want to get some goods between this farm and this flour mill. And for those who have played Roller Tycoon, you might recognise the style of interface, as this was more styled on that game than the earlier Transport Tycoon. And it's quite different from most modern transport sims as well, as you have to pick your starting direction and then select somewhere to start, and then you can extend it by clicking on the box. But if you need to go up a hill, then you'll have to change the angle. Same if you want to go down a hill as well. It won't do that automatically, and same with going around bends. You can select a few different angles depending on the route you're trying to build. But what it will do automatically is build bridges if you're over the current level of the terrain. It is a bit of an odd approach, and I tend to drift between liking it and finding it quite annoying. It all feels a little bit more manual than it really needs to be. But after a little bit of work, our road is in place and we can then put down the depots. Now one neat touch is if the road or track is simple enough, then you don't have to set anything up. You can just place them down and start them off, and away they go. Trains are handled in a very similar way. You manually place down the lines, and you'll have to consider the grade of the turns, as tighter ones will slow the train down. But it does have this nice feature when it comes to the stations, as you don't have to place them down first and then try and join them up afterwards. Instead, you can just add station blocks to the tracks, which means you can really easily set the length and the width of them. So if you want lots of trains to come into it, that is very possible, if you have the space obviously. And doing this will extend the capture area of those stations, so they can get more. And on top of that, it will also help speed up the loading and unloading of the goods. And as we've got a simple route here, I figured it'd be fine enough leaving it with no instructions. But that was proved to be false when it started to collect the paper that the factory was producing. And I've got nowhere for it to go. Now I swear this isn't a tutorial video, it is a real review. But considering that this is so central to the game, I really feel it needs to be covered. And what am I talking about? Well, it's setting up a route itself. So the simple approach is just to select the stations you want it to go to. But in this instance we need to add a little bit more, and that is these orders for it to only load and only unload at those stations. The reason for this is that goods can only be moved to places that will accept them. So coal can go to the power plant, but not the paper mill. But you don't need to do anything with the resulting goods, which as you can imagine really simplifies the chains. So you can just get away with setting up a single route that will keep delivering items to one of these production places. But moving those goods on from those to somewhere else is extra money, so you will want to try and do that where possible. Although at the start of the game you might find there's not many places for them to go to, because towns and villages will only accept people to start with. And it's only through you growing them that they'll become cities or larger, and at which point you'll get a message that will tell you that they're now accepting such and such a good. And this means that while you can make a lot of money from just moving cargo around, building up the towns is also very important, particularly if you want to make the big bucks. And seeing that most of the scenarios has making money as one of the main goals, it will be something you'll need to think about. And as I mentioned near the start of the video, this is a far more scenario based game. But when you complete one, it will give you the option of just keep going. And thus it opens up into that sandbox game that I think most people are really interested in. Now this does mean that you are limited to those mostly predefined maps. That is, unless you go and use the scenario editor to make your own. And after putting in a few basic settings to customize the region that it's taking place in, as well as what industries will show up and what towns you have, you'll get into the map editor, which lets you set the style that the generator should use, which will then allow you to randomize the landscape and then tweak and edit it. Unfortunately, there's no option to change the size of the map, it's completely fixed. And the lack of that, along with no simple way of just generating a random map with some very basic settings, is one of the more disappointing parts of this game. Going back to the gameplay, if there's one thing you need to learn in the early game when you're low on cash and you need to get your tracks to generate more money, is how to get more trains running on them. And for that you'll need to run some parallel tracks. This can either be repeating the whole track, or setting up laybys where they can move past each other. Setting up these will require you to learn about signals, as these tell trains where they can stop and what direction they can travel down a bit of track, depending on the type of signal chosen, as there are a few different ones. And selecting the correct one and knowing where to place them is a bit of a dark art. But it is one that most users will need to learn, and the tutorials will try to explain how to do it. Or you can sit and watch the AI do it and try and learn from them, or there's even a few websites that will try and give you some advice. Or of course, you can go look at the manual if you happen to have it. Get this all right and it can be a massive increase in the cargo capacity of a line. Get it wrong and boom, it's not a happy time. One thing that Transport Tycoon did quite well was to give you mini objectives as you went along. These were in the form of subsidies that would normally ask you to join up two places that haven't been connected before, and the first one to do it would get some extra income from the subsidy. Well, that was one of the features that didn't make it. which means you'll have to be far more self-sufficient in deciding where to build new routes. As well as having to be more careful with your funds, as there aren't easy ways of trying to get some extra cash. But once everything starts running nicely and the money starts flowing in, the game sort of becomes broken, as there's no route too long or too complex that you can't make it. And one of my favourite things to do is try and keep the routes as level as possible, as going up a slope really slows down the vehicles. And it turns out catchment areas aren't affected by height, so you can build these massively high railroads right into the middle of a busy city and then just put a station on the top of it. I have no idea how all those people get to the top of it, but if they're walking, that must take them a good part of the day. Road vehicles and trains aren't your only transport choices in the game, as there are planes and boats. But as you might imagine, they are quite limited in their use, as I tend to find the generated maps tend to be one great big mass, so there's not a lot of places for you to use boats. And in the early game they can only move around people, so you can't even transport goods with them. But when you do get that opportunity, you might think they would be useful for going to the oil rigs. But due to how the trains work, you can just build a track straight out to them instead. Planes do become quite useful for joining up two towns that are quite far away, but without the subsidies, it's more about just wanting to link everything up than any real need to do so. Well, apart from maybe trying to get in there before the AI opponents do. Because you are up against the AI in this game, and they can be quite brutal in competing with you, with them putting down lines to directly compete against you, and they do have a habit of taking what is a nice profitable line and reducing it to a mere trickle, just because they placed a new line right there next to you. And what is a bit of a trend for this game, there's less tools for dealing with them as well. You can't buy them out or even block their construction of their lines, so you'll just have to work around them instead. But possibly the most annoying part of the game is trying to replace any of your vehicles, as everything has a reliability rating that will fall with age, and this will increase its likelihood of breaking down. The problem is there's no simple replace button, so effectively you have to build and place a whole new vehicle with all the stops if you want to replace one. With trains you can sort of get away with placing a new engine and then just rearranging it slightly and possibly having to lay it back down on the track afterwards, but that's possibly the easiest option you have. I feel this video might come across as quite negative, but I do enjoy this game, quite a bit actually. It does have this issue that it lives in this really weird space. It's missing some of the features that I liked of Transport Tycoon, as well as some from more modern titles like Transport Fever. But at the same time, it has its own style and charm about it that just keeps me coming back. It's not a perfect game, but when I hear that title music, and then get down into the nitty gritty of building all those routes, and watching the vehicles going around and bringing in the cash, then the zen-like moments start to come in quite quickly, and you're just engrossed in the game. And if you're interested in it, then you can find it on some of the digital storefronts, and it runs great on modern Windows, and while it might not have quite the range of resolutions, it does have a few widescreen ones that should scale up, like what I've been using for this video. And yes, the game does actually have some options. It's just you have to get into the core game itself before you can change any of them, which does feel a little bit awkward. I know this game had quite mixed reviews and popularity when it launched, but I'd be interested to hear what you thought of this game if you played it in the past, or if you'd like me to cover some more of the newer transport sims, because I am a huge fan of them. So if you have anything to say, please let me know down in the comments. And if you'll excuse me, I've got a train to catch, so until next time, I've been the Goldfish that was, and this has been Goldfish on Games. Thank you for watching me mess around with transport, and if you enjoyed the video then there are some buttons just down there that can help keep the channel on track, or you can move on to another station and check out a few of the other videos that I've done. And if you do that, then I hope to see you again soon.